Okay, what about the subject of fudging dice rolls at the table? It's another controversial one right here. So you've got a strong opinion on it, right?
I do, and we may ruffle some feathers here.
Okay.
My broad thing is that in general, your goal should be to not fudge dice rolls, and that my least controversial way of saying this is that if you fudge a dice roll at the table, every single time you fudge a dice roll, it means that something went wrong. There was a mistake or something broken that you are trying to fix by fudging that dice roll. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you should never fudge the dice, but it means that your goal should be to never fudge the dice, because ideally you will have never made a mistake and you will have never had something broken to begin with. And if you do fudge the dice, you should try to figure out, why did I have to fudge that outcome? And how can I fix things so that in the future, I don't have to fudge that roll again? And like the easiest example of this is before you roll the dice, think about what the outcome of the dice is. What does success look like? And what does failure look like? And you have to ask yourself, am I okay with both of those outcomes? And do I think that the table will be okay with both of those outcomes? And if the answer is no, if I'm not going to be okay with failure, for example, or if I'm not going to be okay with success, then those dice should not be rolled. Either you should default to whatever the outcome that everyone's going to be okay with is, or that you're okay with, or you need to reframe the stakes of the check, possibly through failing forward, for example, in order to create a situation where you are okay with all the possible outcomes of that dice roll. And so that's a really basic example. Another example of where fudging sometimes comes in is like, okay, so you're in a combat encounter and you feel like you need to start fudging dice rolls because the combat encounter has gone in the wrong direction. Maybe you're at a table where TPKs are never okay, and a TPK is imminent, so you need to start fudging dice rolls, for example. And you need to ask yourself, okay, well, why did the encounter end up there, and how could I run better encounters in the future so I wouldn't need to fudge the dice in order to have the encounters land within the parameters that I'm comfortable with? How could I change the game system that I'm using or change the encounters that I'm building in order to not have to fudge the dice in the first place? So that's really where I come from fudging, is that the goal is to never fudge. If you fudged, something is wrong, and you should use that as a diagnostic tool to become a better game master in the future.
Charlie says, Justin, that's a fantastic way to explain dice fudging, why you should or should not do it. So you guys are a fan right there with Justin. Sables must be a harsh DM. Sable says TPKs are always okay. On that subject of the dice fudging, on the Heath Geekverse channel, I did a deep dive, a series of a whole bunch of different videos into dice probability and trying to figure out dice and the way they're interacting with different, resolution mechanics and so forth. And in an attempt to reduce randomness. So this may be a reason why sometimes people need to fudge dice, because my goal in game design has been to reduce randomness. That does not mean eliminate randomness, as I say reduce randomness, and then people in YouTube comments will say, well, then just play a, diceless game or something like that. No, reduce randomness, but not eliminate randomness. But like even in the charts in your book, that like if you've got an easy task and it's a 50-50 coin flip, does that mean that we need to be reevaluating our dice mechanics and our probability tables? Or like, if this is supposed to be something that's easy, does it really make sense that I got a coin flip on whether or not a hero can do it? Should that be a 90% chance? If it's something that's easy, is part of my problem that, easy things, they fail 50% of the time and they're stumbling around all over the place.
Yeah, I think that's 100% correct. I mean, if we narrowly talk, this is a problem across many role-playing games, is you'll get a table of difficulties or like modifiers or whatever the case may be in the system of choice, and there'll be some text label. And the first problem you have is, well, like the subjectiveness of the text label. Okay, so like this is difficult and this is challenging. Without seeing the table, I couldn't even tell you which order those two would necessarily go in, right? Like, is difficult more difficult than challenging, or is challenging more challenging? I don't know. So there's a subjectivity in there. And then also, like, what are we scaling to? Easy under what conditions? Easy for who? And so there's always that, frequently in role-playing games, there's that missing component of like, okay, you say easy, but easy for, like I say, who? Who is it easy for? First level character, an NPC, a 10th level character? Those are probably different things. Right? Is it easy for Superman or is it easy for Lois Lane? Like those are two different characters. What does that mean?
And is it easy when you're just in your living room taking care of it, or is it easy when you've got orcs storming in the door, and you're also.
So, like actually, one of the things I talk about in the book is I have some tables there that use 5th edition D&D as the model for them. But they're tables I often construct for a variety of games that I run, where I actually break down like, okay, well, what are the actual percentages of success for various characters in this? And then I create a structure that lets me both try to model who a check is easy for, like who do I expect to succeed on this check most of the time, and also. So the two things I look at is like who could succeed on this check most of the time, which I usually define as like 75, 80% of the time. Because I find that to be a useful metric when I'm thinking about, okay, well, who, like, if I think about like a chasm, for example, jumping up a chasm. Like, is this something like anybody could do, or is something an Olympic athlete could do, or would you need to be like Hercules to do it? Like, what's that scale? The other thing that I find useful when making rulings on what the difficulty for a check should be is to also think in terms of what, in order to succeed on this at all, how talented would you need to be? And also, who could succeed on this check every single time? Like, for example, jumping over, I'm going to use chasms again. Like, jumping over a short chasm might be easy for, or it might be a difficult chasm for like an average person. But if you were like a master martial artist, or Batman, like that might be the level where you could automatically jump over that chasm every single time. And having those different parameters is something I find useful in terms of like trying to figure out, well, when I'm making a ruling, I find those to be useful categories to think about. The other place where we fall down in terms of probability is what I call rolling to failure, because people really underestimate when you have a sequence of rolls and you have to succeed on every single one of them in order to succeed, how quickly good odds turn into crap odds.
Yes.
If you have to roll 3 or 4 or 5 times in a row, or like stealth is a classic example of this. You'll end up with game masters who are like, why do my players never sneak anywhere? And I'll say, well, how are you resolving stealth checks? And they'll be like, well, everybody rolls their stealth check, and then everybody who's trying to spot them will roll their spot check. And if anybody fails against anybody else, then they get spotted. I'm like, well, that's why they're not stealthing, because there's no way that they can succeed on that check over time, particularly when you then ask them to make the check again every round.
Next turn, right?
Yeah, like, oh, I have to do a best of 5 versus the worst of 5, and I have to do that I'm not going to sneak
4 turns in a row or something to get up to the dungeon. Yeah, or the
so like
or whatever.
if you flip to page 282 of So You Want to Be a Game Master, I talk about rolling to failure, and I talk about a concept called letting it ride. And letting it ride says, so first off, don't just keep making stealth check after stealth check after stealth check. Make one stealth check and say, okay, so James Bond, you've made a stealth check to sneak into the villain's lair. That check determines how good your stealth is for getting into the villain's lair. It rides through the entire. We will ride that check through the entire infiltration mission. I won't ask you to keep rolling it over and over again. It informs us how well this specific attempt is going to go. The other thing you can also do to kind of lessen that as well is to create a point of uncertainty. I kind of talked about this with the traps earlier, where instead of having the failure to detect the trap be the trap explodes, the failure to detect the trap can be you hear a click under your boot. You can do the same thing like with stealth, for example, where you, instead of having the failure state of a stealth check be, oh, you failed your stealth check, so the security guard spots you. The failure of the stealth check can be, you hear a security guard coming from around the corner. What do you do? So that point of uncertainty gives the players a chance to come up with some creative way of overcoming the failure. And the one key thing there is that if you fail a stealth check, for example, the way that you avoid the failure should not be just make another stealth check. It should be, you need to jump out the window and hang from the balcony, so make an athletics check. Or you quickly throw on a disguise, so make a disguise check. Or, something along those lines. You need to think of a different way of approaching the problem. But that's another way that you can kind of help deal with some of those problems of probability.